So I think we can start. Well, it's an honor and a real pleasure to be here today to chair George Varuksakis' lecture. I apologize that I could not be with you in the morning, but you know that there is unrest, students' unrest in Greece after the accident at Tempe, and the university, I need to be there the whole day. Anyway, so in the context of this very, very interesting conference, the keynote lecture is offered by Professor Varuksakis, who studied history at the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens, and then at the UCL, both master's and PhD. He is professor of the history of political thought at Queen Mary University of London and co-director of the Center for the Study of the History of Political Thought. He is the author of many books. I'm going to mention them, but I have to put on my glasses because these are okay, so that I'm not going to make any mistake. First, Liberty Abroad, a J.S. Mill on International Relations, 2013, Mill on Nationality, 2002, Victorian Political Thought on France and the French, 2002, again, and the co-author of Contemporary France, An Introduction to French Politics and Society, 2003. And he's currently completed a book, which is, I think, is part of, rather his talk is going to be part of this book under the title Occident, The History of the Idea of the West, to be published by Princeton University Press. Giorgos Varuksakis, in the name of Europe, Christendom, or the Occident, Resurgent Hellas, and the Idea of the West.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Christina, for this very generous introduction. Thank you all for being here. It's a wonderful pleasure to be among friends, old and new. If I was less tired and had slept more, I would completely abandon my preciously produced slides and my text and speak extempore, because I have been inspired and given better ideas and more ideas by so many of the papers, all the papers I attended, and those I didn't attend, it was not out of choice. I swear I couldn't be here. And that is an unmissable sign of a good conference. The fact that all the papers spoke to me and made me change my arguments and my ideas and my formulation of what I mean to say. So the organizers need to be congratulated. With the exception of your choice of keynote lecturer, you've done extremely well in your selections. In this lecture, I wish to examine whether and to what extent the Greek Revolution affected the emergence or meanings of a socio-political idea of the West. Or was the whole discussion on the role and future of the Greeks conducted in the register of different concepts, such as Christendom, Europe, or civilization too cool? Did people in Western Europe and the United States greet the emergence or resurrection of Greece as a member of Christendom, Europe, or some other entity? The enterprise is premised on my conviction that though there is serious overlapping involved among these concepts, Europe, Christendom, and the West mean different things with different political implications. Words and names do matter. I propose to take issue with two claims that are routinely made in the relevant literature, and then to suggest a more modest and nuanced argument on the role of the Greek Revolution in the gradual emergence and spread of ideas of the West as a supranational political or cultural entity. The first claim I wish to take issue with is the argument that, as far as the United States was concerned, I'm quoting, the Greek independence movement popularized Western civilization, a concept widely traced in the modern era from ancient Greece and Rome to Northern Europe and ultimately to the United States, end of quote. I will argue very briefly that that story is more complicated. The second claim I am not convinced by is the widely repeated argument that the emergence of the idea of the West in Western Europe was somehow deeply affected by the Russian debates sparked by the publication of Peter Chahadaev's first philosophical letter in 1836. I argue that there was instead a different Russian connection with a Greek twist, but Chahadaev was not the source. Finally, I will suggest a different articulation of the civilizational discussion that Greece was becoming a part of. I take my cue from a statement by the major scholar of French Orientalism, Henri Lorentz, who very recently, in an essay on the invention of the idea of the Mediterranean, argued l'invention de la Méditerranée comme catégorie intellectuelle résulte de l'expédition de Morée. The invention of the Mediterranean as an intellectual category resulted from the expedition to the Morea, the French expedition to the Morea in the late 1820s. Could anything similar be said of the invention of the West as a category, is my question, in other words. For many Philhellenic men of letters in the 1820s, a frequent motto from the beginning, from the first year, was Die Sache der Griechen, die Sache Europas, the cause of Greece, the cause of Europe, as a characteristically titled pamphlet they published in 1821 put it. It had been written by Heinrich Gottlieb Schirner, professor of theology at Leipzig. The pamphlet was immediately translated, into English and had a wide circulation. It was, for instance, published in the Calcutta Journal, reprinted, in the Calcutta Journal, as far as India. There were literally, in that text, there were literally dozens of evocations of the European character and civilization of the Greeks, and a smaller number of references to their belonging to Christendom. After all, he was a theologian. Meanwhile, there was no mention of the West. And the Greek Declaration of Independence that was issued in the beginning of 1822 again tried to appeal to the European and Christian commonalities between the Greeks and their aspired audiences, but not a word was said on the West. Now, given how keen the Greeks were, let's forget about Europe for a minute and think of America. We know how keen they were to appeal to America. We know the Mavromichalis Messenian Senate sending to Everett and other Americans their pleas and so on. This declaration was sent to America. Given how keen the Greeks were for American support, one could anachronistically have expected their declaration and their other public pronouncements to appeal to a shared Western solidarity, Western civilization, and the like. But that was not the case, and there is a very simple reason why. Western civilization did not yet exist as a category, certainly not in the United States. So, as a book, relatively recent book by Claude Conter, Jenseits der Nation, on the literary ideas of Europe of the 19th century, when it comes to the literary Philhellenism chapter, it's called Literarischer Philhellenismus in Namen Europas. It was in the name of Europe. In America, it couldn't be in the name of Europe, but it was in the name of Christendom, liberty, and civilization, as we heard earlier by Elisabeth, for example, many times. But what seemed to prevail among most of the people and texts were evocations of shared Christendom. Frustrated at the authoritarian policies of the Prussian government, the young and staunchly liberal Franz Lieber went to Greece to fight in January 1822. He was to be bitterly disappointed by the Greeks he met in the Morea and fled to Italy 3 months later. He was saved by the historian Niebuhr, who was the Prussian ambassador in Rome, luckily for him. He was eventually to migrate to America, where he became an eminent academic, founder of American political science, founding editor of the Encyclopedia Americana, the first American encyclopedia, and much, much more. But before all that, before he went to America a few years later, in 1823 he published a Tagebuch meines Aufhaltes in Griechenland während der Monate Januar, Februar und März im Jahre 1822, his handbook of his stay in Greece, where he concluded, his conclusion of that pamphlet was, "My painful duty," forget about that, we have no time, "my painful duty is accomplished if I have shown the true state of affairs and proved, first, that the cowardice and incapacity of the Greeks made them unfit to defend or free their country. Second, that no individual, not even an experienced commander, could assist them. Third, that a small army, properly equipped, might scour the whole country and rescue it. Fourth, that by this means the country may be preserved to Christianity." Note the entity for which Liber wanted to preserve Greece. I'm glad that wasn't me. It's very often me. Now, what was happening in the country Liber was to migrate to 4 years later? I will skip my text because, as I said, so much has inspired me that I will address it very quickly in order to move on. But basically, what I quoted to you earlier is the standard, it was quoted by a very recent book, 2015, and it's endlessly repeated, this stereotype that that the Greek War of Independence inspired Americans through the American fever to embrace this idea of Western civilization, where they put themselves, of course, at the very top of it, at the very end of it, and it starts from Athens and so on. That is all anachronistic, I'm afraid, projecting back to the Greek War of Independence, what happened in America after the Second World War with the creation of the Western Civ curriculum in Columbia and other American universities. That was the grand narrative of from Plato to NATO and so on, democracy from Athens via Renaissance republics, a tiny bit of Rome, but Rome, not good news because it stopped being a republic, and then Enlightenment Europe, and then the United States. The word the West had a completely different meaning in America. It meant their ever-shifting frontier. And the Americans, as Elizabeth reminded us earlier, always, in the early decades of their existence, insisted that they were not like these corrupt Europeans. They were not imperialists like the Europeans they rebelled against. They were not imperialistic powers. So the idea that the Americans identified with a Western civilization in which they supported the Greeks in the same way as the French and the English and so on was not plausible. The Americans got inspired for reasons we heard and will hear again, seeing a nation rebelling against an empire which was Christian. If I had time, I would refer to an article written by the most prominent American philhellene, Edward Everett, another product of Göttingen University, by the way, who, when he was the editor of the North American Review, the most hegemonic intellectual magazine of the East Coast of America and East Anglia and so on, wrote a very long review article on Corais, and that man didn't mention the word West a single time. He kept insisting these are Christians who actually read in their churches from the original New Testament, which we don't. These are civilized people. They have spent an awful lot on education. Their schools in Chios and so on have as many books as Harvard College. He followed the narrative of Corais in Mémoires sur l'état de la civilisation dans la Grèce in 1803, whom he had met in Paris, of course, and he knew very well. And he promoted the idea that we have to support the Greeks because they are civilized, fighting barbarians, they are educated, they have made enormous strides in civilization and commerce, and they are Christians. No West was involved. The West had not been invented as far as America is concerned. I'm obviously happy to elaborate on this if there are questions. So what about my other myth, or a claim that I want to argue against? There is another persistent myth, and as Paul said this morning about the geography books, they all plagiarize each other or repeat each other. There is also in scholarship, unfortunately, when an idea becomes popular, it's not plagiarism because people attribute most of the time the source, but there is this persistent idea now in all histories of the idea of the West, that the idea of the West was more or less invented by Petr Chadaev, who wrote in French in 1829 the first philosophical letter, which was not published until 1836 in Russia, and caused a huge controversy. And then for some decades there were the controversies between Westernizers and Slavophiles. And the Western Europeans got all that debate and the very term the West from there. Unadulterated nonsense. The word the West existed. It didn't mean exactly what we mean by it, but the meanings that Chadaev gave to it in the 1830s were already there even before the Greek Revolution, as we'll see now, and certainly were beginning during the Greek Revolution to gain more and more traction. It's a gradual process which is culminated in the 1830s and 40s. So, in fact, instead of Chadaev, and let me see where I am with my slides. Yeah, there he is. Instead of Chadaev, there is another unnoticed Russian and Greek Orthodox connection, and earlier than the Greek Revolution, a few years before the Greek Revolution. Incidentally, we heard this morning in at least one of the papers that, Aristides' paper, that in England they were very open in the late teens of the 19th century that a Greek independence has to happen. Greek independence was discussed openly in some newspapers and circles. Similarly, Joseph de Maistre finishes his book Du Pape on the Pope in 1817, publishes it in 1819. In the fourth part of the book, he begins the part on modern Greece by saying, we all know the Greeks are up to something. There is a very wide discussion. The Greeks are up to something. There is going to be a Greece. Let's see what we can expect of the modern Greeks. That's the title of a section of the book. So, de Maistre was clear in his correspondence that he wrote Du Pape, and particularly Book 4, on the schismatic churches, which is the most passionate part of the book, as the anti-Sturza. He called it the anti-Sturza. Why is that? Because there was this man, Alexander Sturza, of Moldovan father and Greek Phanariot mother origins. The family moved to the Russian part when Bessarabia was taken away. The part of Moldova that became Bessarabia was taken by the Russians. They were persecuted by the Turks. Alexander Sturza and his sister Roxandra, who was a very close friend of de Maistre for some years, Roxandra Sturza, Alexander, in 1816, published a book called Considérations sur la doctrine et l'esprit de l'Église orthodoxe, so Considerations on the Doctrine and Spirit of the Orthodox Church, published in Stuttgart in 1816, as I keep saying. The book had been written on the request of Tsar Alexander, apparently, who paid 20,000 rubles for its publication. Besides aiming to appeal to people in Germany, Sturza's book was meant to attack Catholic temptations to conversion in Russian high society, which were very, very clearly promoted, and it was known by de Maistre while he was an ambassador of Savoy, of the Kingdom of Savoy, to St. Petersburg between 1803 and 1817. For 14 years he was there. This is the time when the Jesuits were expelled from Russia, so it's not accidental. They were worried about these activities. Sturza's book, Alexander Sturza's book, was vehemently critical of Catholicism, l'Église d'Occident, the Church of the West, l'Occident, the West, and les Occidentaux, the Westerners, and castigated la haine aveugle des barbares de l'Occident, the blind hatred of the barbarians of the West that had contributed to the fall of Byzantium. Mestre thought he had to respond. In his correspondence, Mestre made clear, I hope you're impressed by the way they are moved. Obviously, this has nothing to do with me and everything to do with my 14-year-old who helped me with this. It wasn't my idea, but he said you will be impressed. In his correspondence, de Maistre showed himself explicitly aware and annoyed by the highly anti-Western tone of Sturza's book. So he wrote, referring to Sturza, un homme que je considère infiniment, qui appartient à la Grèce par la naissance, vient de publier contre l'Église catholique un ouvrage écrit avec une amertume remarquable. Pour exprimer, par exemple, notre incapacité connue en tout genre de sciences, on nous y nomme les simples occidentaux. And a man that I esteem infinitely, enormously, who belongs to Greece by birth, has just published against the Catholic Church a work written with a remarkable bitterness. To express, for example, our well-known incapacity in all kinds of sciences, he calls us the simple Westerners, or the plain Westerners. As I said already, I think, Joseph de Maistre was a Savoyard philosopher and diplomat and had been ambassador of the Kingdom of Sardinia to Russia from 1803 to 1817. He finished writing the book in 1817 before leaving St. Petersburg. So this is a Russian book. It's written with the experiences in Russia of a Western diplomat, or a Savoyard diplomat, a Catholic French-speaking diplomat of a small state, for 14 years reflecting on Catholicism through the prism of its relations with the schismatic Photians, as he called them. He insisted, don't call them Orthodox. They want to be called Orthodox. Orthodox means the right faith. They are Photians. They are followers of Photius, the schismatic. It was written with enormous passion. I recommend the book strongly. It was almost written in a delirium, but then you can see what he was responding to, as in a brilliant book, Carolina Armenteros, a brilliant book on de Maistre, comments correctly. The fourth part of the book, Du Pape, was an uninterrupted rant against the Greeks. And she comments, more than a little resentment against Roxandra and her brother may have gone into this diatribe, modeled on Alexander Sturza's own fits of spite against Russian Catholics in the Considération sur la doctrine, etc., etc. So this de Maistre, among other things, as I said, about the Greeks, ancient and modern, at some point in the book says, a fatal error of Greece, and which unfortunately has not the appearance of coming soon to an end, is that it relies upon ancient recollections and attributes in attributing to itself, I know not what imaginary existence, which never ceases to deceive it. It even goes to the length of speaking about rivalry as regards us. Of old, perhaps, this rivalry had a basis and a meaning. But how can there be rivalry nowadays when on the one side there is everything and on the other nothing? Is it the glory of arms or that of science which Greece would dispute with us? It styles itself the East, while as regards the real East, it is only a point of the West, and to us it is scarcely visible. But de Maistre was promoting a kind of ecumenical European unity under the Pope, and was calling the schismatics to join the real church, the one church, the church that has created what he called the European Republic. The Pope created Europe. When Pope Leo III, who was Greek, by the way, but that's another matter, crowned Charlemagne as... excuse me, I'm really sorry. When the Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne Emperor of Roman Emperor in 1800, he created Europe, says de Maistre and so on. So he said to the Greeks, please, you have to join, but forget about Byzantium and Photius and so on. So, may Greece proper, the Greece so well defined by Cicero, separate, Greece proper again, Aristides, as you were saying this morning, separate forever from that fatal Byzantium, of old only a Greek colony, and whose imaginary supremacy is wholly founded on titles which no longer exist. We are told of Phocion, of Pericles, of Epaminondas, of Socrates, of Plato, of Agesilaus, etc., etc. Let us treat then with their descendants without troubling ourselves about the municipia. There is on our side neither hatred nor any bitterness of feeling. Let us embrace once more, never again to be thrown asunder. So, what I'm trying to say is that if anywhere the beginning of uses of Western and the West is in recognizably modern senses, and I'm very happy to explain what I mean if you want, if it's not clear, can be traced, it is there. That debate, the meanings they gave to it, is much closer to what happened later than anything else, and certainly Chadaev comes later and has read de Maistre and has met de Maistre and is influenced by de Maistre as well as other French thinkers, French-speaking thinkers. Now, the fact that de Maistre was one of the most influential thinkers in the thought of Auguste Comte, who is the person who finally articulates the most articulate, comprehensive, thorough idea of the West ever written, and I'm saying this after more than 10 years of research, is not accidental. So that's why I'm insisting on him. But I will leave, you will be relieved to know I have no time to talk about Auguste Comte today. Now, we saw in America how important Christianity was. We saw a bit of Germany. What about America? What about France? Christianity was also crucial to the popularity of the Greek cause in France, where it was adopted by people from all sides of the political spectrum. I'm sure we'll hear more about it tomorrow, especially around 1825. A striking case was the pamphlet published in 1825 by Benjamin Constant, member of the National Assembly at the time, on behalf of the Comité des Grecs of the Société de la Morale Chrétienne, and entitled Appel aux Nations Chrétiennes, Appel aux Nations Chrétiennes en faveur des Grecs, 1825. Constant's pamphlet used many different arguments, but the Greeks being Christians fighting against Muslims, Muslim conquerors, was the main one. But there was more than Christendom. In the quotation that I will spare you, because we have no time, he criticizes, as many on the left in France, of course, did at the time, he criticizes the French governments for supporting the Egyptian or Turkish army by training them, and the Egyptian army of Ibrahim was in the Peloponnese, trained by Frenchmen. And he said that already Napoleon had started these things, and that France, by supporting the Ottoman Empire or Egypt, and therefore now weakening the Greeks, was, as he says in that quotation, ainsi disparaît ou s'affaiblit la garantie véritable de l'Occident vers contre l'Orient, de la civilisation contre l'État à demi sauvage. We have one of the very early uses of Occident in this debate to say Greece would be a rampart of the West, and boulevard de l'Occident ou de l'Europe, as he says later, against whoever comes. He says, I'm not worried about the Ottoman Empire coming and conquering Western Europe, but who knows what kind of new Mohammed, what kind of prophet, what kind of conqueror may come. Greece would be a bulwark, a buffer state, a buffer zone for the Occident, he says. Obviously, most of the time he says Europe, like most people, but here he uses the word West. He goes on, in a quotation I will spare you, to say that the Western Europeans, this is the man who 6 years earlier had written on the liberty of the moderns versus the liberty of the ancients in the famous lecture at the Athénée Royal. So he used one of the themes there. We are amolli, we are softened. These are people who are not afraid to die. They are true believers in Christianity and are fighting. So they would help us defend ourselves against any potential threats if we help them. And so he ends in that the cause of Christ is our cause. But that is nothing compared to what comes next. And I know that Denis Barrault, who we are very fortunate to have here speaking on Friday, has written a marvelous article very recently on de Prat in the Historical Review and what kind of Greece he was promoting. I recommend it very strongly. So for my purposes, Dominique Dufour, he had many names, de Prat, the Abbé de Prat, a kind of lesser Talleyrand in his changes of loyalties, or as somebody said of him in the 20th century, the Walter Lippmann of the 19th century, and that is immense compliment if you know how important Walter Lippmann was. This man is very important for the reasons that Paul mentioned this morning when he was talking about the importance of the geography books and how themes that are popular, themes that are repeated, not because they're original, but exactly because they are unoriginal and repeated, they become stereotypes. They become what people sort of assume. So de Prat was that kind of thinker. He was not original, but he was extremely best-selling. His books, if you see the editions, how many new editions of most of his books came out, how many of them were translated into other languages, you see why it's crucial to look at what this man was doing, despite his lack of originality. He begins early on. He writes several books on Greece, beginning with De la Grèce dans ses rapports avec l'Europe. Very early on in the book, he says in this quotation, I am obviously, I take the point of view of Europe. I'm a European. I'm not looking at the point of view of my country, France. What suits my country is the European interest, thankfully. Well, of course, we all know people do that, especially in France, I must say. Sometimes with good reason, sometimes exaggerating, but he was insisting, my point of view is European. What is in the interest of Europe? So everything I will say in this book is going to be about the interests of Europe. And he goes on to say, in this quotation here, somewhere in the book, he says, de plus, la civilisation, in addition, the civilization of the Greeks is not limited by the rigid immobility of that of the Turks. The first are Europeans subject to the mobility which people of the West are used to. They are Westerners living in the soul, inhabiting the soul of Turkey, like in the same way as the Turks are Orientals encamped somehow in the land of Europe. In consequence, the Greeks are sustained, and so on. You get the picture again. Very explicit. Although European is his point of view, he begins to use Occidental and Occident a lot in that book, and in the rest of the books even more. I am just wondering, oh yes, okay, I haven't missed any of my quotations. His great problem, he says, is that the most present evil in Europe is the supremacy of Russia. The whole of Europe should be grateful to the Greeks because the Greeks are the only country that are able to replace the Ottoman Empire as a bulwark against Russian encroachment. That is his argument. And he says that again and again and again. I should clarify that, as Monsieur Barrault makes clear, by Greece, he doesn't mean Greece proper, he doesn't mean the Peloponnese and the Aegean. Greece has to be a great state. The age of small states is over. Greece has to have its northern borders in the Danube. Thank you. So we heard this morning similar plans. He was even more ambitious. Now look at this. He has again and again and repeatedly said the Ottoman Empire is stagnant, it is not civilized, it's impossible for them to stop the Russians can do whatever they like with them, and instead of investing in them, invest in the Greeks. The Greeks are civilized, but he uses ancient Greece a little bit, but his main point is civilization in the sense the enormous strides of commerce, the marine of the Greeks, and education in the last few decades. So again, the arguments of Corais that he was very aware of, the famous Mémoire sur l'état de la civilisation dans la Grèce. And they are going to be very good clients for European commerce and industry because they are civilized, because they are Europeans, they have the same tastes as us, and they are going to thrive, and they are going to be good markets, as well as be a thriving state that will stop the Russians. So look at this quotation, which I think is one of the most crucial. Consequently, there is nothing in this pretended barrier against Russia, the Ottoman Empire. There is a void, a lacuna, which we have to fill. We need, therefore, to create a point of resistance so that the burden doesn't fall on the side of the West, abandoned to itself. So now Greece is not in the West. The West is where it is. It's the old Western Roman Empire. You know, it's the empire of Charlemagne. But Greece, joining it or becoming an adjunct of it in some way, will now help it share the burden of defending Europe from the Russians. In the current state, it is to Greece. It is to the West to support this burden, the burden of defending Europe against the Russians. But Turkey, because Turkey has nothing to do with the affair. Turkey is impotent, in his opinion. Taking the question, addressing the question from the point of view of safeguards for Europe, one will be convinced that if the Greek Revolution didn't exist, we would have to invent it. Quite a statement. So a godsend. All the problems that in the morning I was lucky to hear about people contemplating about the ambiguity of Greece. How can Greece be both Oriental and the cradle of civilization and Europe and so on? All these things will be solved. The Greek Revolution has come to solve these problems. And solve the defense problem of Europe. And if you have any doubt about what he believed, there is another striking quotation that I will spare you. You can see here, having reached this point of power, Russia has divided Europe in two parts, the East and the West of this area. There is now, Europe is divided. There is the East and the West. The West is Russia, and the East is Russian completely. The West trembles. Every time Russia moves, the West trembles because they are divided. So, of course, there is a solution. The European system is divided in two branches, one defensive, the other offensive. The first is Western Europe. The second belongs to Russia. Each individual state cannot defend itself. So what is the solution? The solution is the solution is European federation. It's needed to create a federative system which will give guarantee of all for each. And as you see in the end, European federation of all the Western countries to defend themselves against Russia. So you see why I was alluding that there are some ideas of the West sounding quite close to what we understand by the West today. and why this is the genealogy, these are the stages. Obviously, I had no time to go through all of my evidence. Thankfully, believe me, it's a lot. But this is how I see it, because what I try to do in my book is, every time I speak, I'm asked how it relates to Edward Said. I'm not dealing with Edward Said for a very simple reason. It's a different enterprise. Of course, Edward Said was very important, and of course the Europeans, or Christians, or Westerners, or whatever you call them, built an idea of the East, and many of them, though not all, caricatured it, orientalized it for their own purposes, and built their own self-image as against it. What I'm trying to say, though, is the Europeans or Christians were perfectly happy to orientalize the East, calling themselves Europe or Christendom, and there are differences and there are reasons when Europe replaces Christendom, which I will spare you unless you ask me. Why do they suddenly at some point start thinking of the West? The West was not invented against the Ottoman Empire. The West was not invented against Islam. The West was needed against Russia. Because since Peter the Great, Russia became part of Europe. It imposed itself on the European system politically and culturally to a great extent. It managed to be accepted as a European country and a European. So you have people explicitly in the mid-18th century starting to say, we should stop using the word the West, Europe, because it's confusing. It includes too much and excludes parts that should be part of it, which is the colonies of the West Europeans in America and Australia and New Zealand and so on. So that's how the West was, little by little, became more and more popular. The story begins here in a way, and de Pratt, although he's a very boring thinker in other ways, is crucial in showing us the transition and initiating it, obviously following all sorts of clues he found in other authors. You've been extremely patient. Thank you very much. And the chair who has been so tolerant with me.